poor girl fed a silent boy outside a school fence. No cameras, no witnesses. Years later, that boy returned as someone else. The street was already loud before the day had properly begun. Buses hissed at the curb. Shoes scraped against concrete. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled through an open window, fighting to be heard over traffic. It was the kind of street people walked past every day without seeing. Ordinary, forgettable, a place where nothing important was supposed to happen. But that morning, something did. Emily stood near the fence outside the school, her backpack hanging loose on one shoulder, lunch balanced carefully in her hands. Not much, just enough. Food packed by someone who already knew how to stretch very little into even less. Emily wasn't looking for praise. Emily wasn't looking for gratitude. Emily was just looking at him. James stood a few steps away, pressed slightly into the shadow of the gate. Too thin for his hoodie, dirt under his fingernails, eyes that kept dropping to the container, then darting away, as if hunger itself were something to be ashamed of. James hadn't asked for anything. James never did. That was what made it harder. Around them, adults passed. Teachers, parents, strangers with places to be. No one slowed down. No one noticed the space between them, the quiet standoff between a child who had food and a child who didn't. Emily hesitated. At home, there were rules about portions, about saving, about tomorrow. Giving this away meant explaining later why Emily came back hungry. It meant lying, or telling the truth and watching worry spread across a tired face. It meant making a choice no one would ever applaud. Emily took a step forward anyway. The container felt warmer than it should have, as if it carried more than food inside it. Emily held it out, her hands steady, her expression calm, like this was the most natural thing in the world, like feeding a stranger was as ordinary as breathing. For a second, James didn't move. Then James reached for it. Their fingers almost touched. In that instant, on that cracked sidewalk, beneath a sky that looked like every other sky, a future quietly shifted its direction. No witnesses, no record, just a small human act, barely visible against the noise of the world. Emily thought she was just feeding a hungry boy. Emily had no idea she was shaping who James would become. Every morning followed the same rhythm. The alarm rang before the sun fully settled into the sky. Shoes were slipped on quietly. A bag was packed with care that came from practice, not comfort. By the time Emily stepped outside, the street was already awake, buses groaning, vendors shouting, life moving fast for people who couldn't afford to stop. School sat at the end of the block, wrapped in a tall metal fence, its paint peeled in places, rust biting through years of neglect. Inside the fence was order, bells, lines, classrooms. Outside it was everything else. That fence mattered more than anyone realized. Emily walked the same path every day, past the same cracks in the pavement, past the same posters curling off brick walls. And almost every day, James was there. At first, Emily noticed James the way you notice a shadow, not directly, but enough to know something was off. James stood just beyond the gate, never crossing it, never stepping too close, always watching. Not the students, the food. Lunch hour turned the schoolyard into noise, laughter, trades, complaints. But on the other side of the fence, there was silence. Not empty silence, waiting silence, the kind that presses in on you slowly until you feel it in your chest. Hunger didn't look the way movies showed it. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was the way James's eyes followed hands instead of faces, the way James swallowed when wrappers crinkled, the way James's shoulders pulled inward, as if making himself smaller could make the feeling pass. Emily saw all of it. At home, food was never wasted. Every meal had a reason. Emily's family lived on careful planning and smaller portions. You didn't complain. You didn't ask for seconds.
You finished what you were given and said thank you. So the first time Emily thought about sharing, she didn't act. Emily felt the weight of the container in her bag and kept walking. The next day, Emily slowed down. The day after that, Emily stopped. The fence stood between them, thin metal bars pretending to be a boundary, pretending to separate safety from danger, deserving from undeserving. But hunger passed through it easily. Adults passed too. Teachers walked by with coffee cups and clipboards. Security guards leaned against walls. Parents waited in cars. No one asked why James was always there. No one questioned why James never went inside. The system had decided James wasn't part of the story. Emily hadn't. The first time Emily handed James food, her hands shook. Emily waited for someone to stop her, to ask questions, to say something. Nothing happened. The world kept moving, indifferent and loud, while something small and important slipped through unnoticed. James took the container carefully, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. James didn't say thank you. James just nodded. That felt heavier somehow. Emily went home that day with an empty stomach. Her mother noticed the silence first. "You're quiet," her mother said, setting dishes in the sink. "I'm fine," Emily replied, too quickly. That night, hunger felt different, sharper, not because it was worse, but because it was chosen, because it came with an image Emily couldn't stop replaying. A boy sitting on the curb, eating slowly, like he didn't know when the next meal would come. The next morning, Emily packed lunch again, and again, Emily gave it away. This wasn't a moment, it became a pattern. Days turned into weeks, weeks into routine. James waited in the same place. Emily approached at the same time. No words, just an exchange. Food moving from one life into another. Each time, the sacrifice grew a little heavier. Some days, Emily gave away the best part. Some days, Emily kept nothing for herself. Once, Emily tied a loose thread from her sleeve around the container so it wouldn't spill. Emily forgot to untie it. The thread stayed. A thin piece of fabric, faded, almost invisible. But it came back every day, wrapped around the food like a quiet promise no one had named yet. At home, questions began to form. "You didn't eat again?" "I wasn't hungry." That lie hurt more than the hunger. At school, whispers started. A classmate noticed Emily sitting alone. A teacher glanced twice when Emily skipped the cafeteria line. No one said anything out loud. Silence was easier. James still hadn't spoken. Until one afternoon when rain pressed the noise of the city flat and the street emptied faster than usual. Emily handed James the container, lighter than before, the thread still tied around the edge. James's fingers brushed Emily's. "Why?" James asked. The word caught Emily off guard. Emily shrugged. "Because you're hungry." James looked at Emily for a long time, longer than was comfortable, like he was memorizing something. Then James said it, quietly, almost to himself. "If I ever get out of this, I'll come back." Emily didn't know what James meant. Emily didn't know what it would cost. And Emily had no idea what that promise would become. Nothing about that morning felt different. The sky carried the same dull light. The street moved with the same tired urgency. Emily walked the familiar path, her backpack tapping softly against her side, the small container warm through the fabric. Emily was already thinking about where James would be standing. Near the third fence post, slightly back from the gate, close enough to see, far enough not to be noticed. But when Emily reached the school, the space was empty. At first, Emily didn't react. Emily slowed, adjusted her bag, and looked again. Sometimes James arrived late. Sometimes James waited until the bell rang. Emily told herself that. Emily leaned against the fence and watched the sidewalk. Minutes passed. Lunch noise began to rise behind Emily, Lockers slamming, voices overlapping, the rush of people who expected to eat. Emily stayed where she was. The container cooled in her hands. Emily scanned the street. No thin hoodie, no familiar posture, no eyes watching from the edge. A small unease crept in. Not panic, not yet, just the feeling that something had slipped slightly out of place. Emily waited through the bell. When it rang, students poured past Emily. Someone bumped her shoulder. Someone laughed too loudly. No one stopped. No one noticed Emily wasn't moving. Emily checked again after class. Still nothing. The second day, Emily arrived earlier. The third, Emily waited longer. Each time, the same absence greeted Emily. Not dramatic, not explained.
Just an empty stretch of sidewalk where a person used to be. Emily asked quietly at first. A security guard shrugged. A teacher said, "Probably moved on." A woman selling snacks shook her head. No one knew, or no one cared enough to know. The fence didn't change. The street didn't change. Everything looked exactly the same, except for the space where James should have been. Emily began to feel foolish standing there with food meant for someone who might never come back. On the fourth day, Emily sat on the curb and waited until the container grew cold, then took it home untouched. Her mother noticed. "You didn't give it away today," her mother said carefully. "No," Emily replied. That night, the thread lay on Emily's desk, still tied, still intact. It looked smaller now, fragile, like something that belonged to the past even though only days had passed. Emily stopped bringing extra food after that, not because Emily didn't care, because Emily didn't know who she was caring for anymore. Weeks went by, then months. The memory softened at the edges, the way childhood memories do when they don't have a place to land. Emily stopped looking for James, but Emily never stopped noticing the fence or the silence on the other side of it. The promise echoed sometimes, uninvited, unfinished. "If I ever get out of this, I'll come back." It had sounded solid when James said it, certain, like a plan. Now it felt like a sentence without an ending. The thread was folded and tucked away, not thrown out, not used, just kept. It no longer meant tomorrow, it meant before. Life moved on the way it always does when it doesn't wait for answers. Years passed. The promise stayed exactly where it was. Morning arrived without urgency. Light slid through floor-to-ceiling glass and settled across polished stone, furniture arranged by people who had never worried about space. The city stretched below in clean lines and distant noise, muted by height and money and glass. Everything here was designed to impress. Nothing was designed to comfort. James stood still for a long time before moving. The routine was precise: shower, suit, coffee James barely tasted, a schedule planned days in advance by assistants who spoke in efficient sentences and never asked personal questions. James's name carried weight now. Doors opened before James reached them. People listened when James spoke. This was what success looked like. It just didn't feel like anything. Silence followed James everywhere. Not the silence of hunger or waiting. This was different. This was emptiness padded with luxury. No interruptions, no urgency, no need. Just quiet rooms and uninterrupted thoughts James couldn't escape. On James's desk, beneath neat stacks of documents and devices worth more than entire homes, sat something that didn't belong. A thin thread. Faded, frayed, tied carefully around nothing at all. James hadn't planned to keep it this long. At first, it had been a reminder, proof that the memory wasn't something James had imagined in a harder life. Later, it became something else, an anchor, a line tied to a version of himself that felt more real than the one reflected in glass walls and polished surfaces. James touched it once before leaving.
every day, James told himself he was too busy to think about Emily, and every day, the thought found James anyway. The search didn't begin dramatically. There were no investigators at first, no sweeping gestures, just quiet questions folded into conversations that didn't sound like questions at all. Names mentioned casually, locations referenced offhand, records checked under the excuse of philanthropy or expansion. James told himself it was about gratitude. James told himself it was about closure. But at night, alone in rooms too large for one person, the truth surfaced uninvited. This wasn't about thanking someone for kindness long past. This was about a debt that had never stopped accumulating. James didn't know if Emily remembered him. Worse, James didn't know if Emily still existed. Files came back empty. Neighborhoods changed. Schools shut down. Families moved. The world had not paused while James disappeared. It had shifted, erased, rebuilt itself without regard for promises made by children. That uncertainty followed James everywhere. Meetings blurred together. Applause felt distant. James smiled when expected to, nodded at the right moments, shook hands with people who admired the idea of him without knowing anything underneath it. They saw power. They didn't see the waiting. Missed connections became routine. A woman with a similar story, but not the right one. A school record that ended abruptly. A community center closed 3 years too early. Each almost felt worse than nothing. One afternoon, James's car slowed near an old street he hadn't seen in decades. Construction had reshaped it, but some things resisted change. The curve of the road, the angle of the light, the way sound carried. The fence was still there, rust eaten deeper now, paint chipped beyond repair, but unmistakable. The driver asked if James wanted to continue. James didn't answer right away. This wasn't on the schedule, it wasn't part of the plan. It was a detour James had avoided for years, afraid to what it might confirm or deny. "Stop," James said finally. James stepped out alone. The street looked smaller than James remembered, or maybe James was just bigger now, taller, heavier with years and experience and loss that didn't have a name. Children passed where James once stood, carrying backpacks, laughing, unaware of the quiet history embedded in the concrete beneath their feet. James walked to the fence. James's hand rested against the cold metal without thinking. This was where it began. Not the hunger, not the struggle, the kindness. James stood there longer than necessary, long enough for memory to blur with reality, long enough to feel the distance between who James had been and who James had become. From across the street, someone watched James. Emily didn't recognize James. Why would Emily? The man at the fence looked nothing like the boy Emily remembered. The thin frame, the silence, the eyes that avoided hers. This man wore confidence like armor. His posture was straight. His presence commanded space without effort. Emily noticed James only because he seemed out of place. People like James didn't linger here. Emily hesitated, then continued walking. James turned at the sound of footsteps. The moment stretched. Not recognition, not yet, just a pause, subtle, fleeting, like two lives brushing past each other without realizing how closely they were aligned. James watched Emily walk away, something tightening in his chest without explanation, something familiar, something James hadn't felt in years. Emily was closer than James realized. The first time their worlds collided, it happened in a room full of people. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped against the floor. A banner hung crookedly at the front of the community hall, announcing a program that promised change in careful, hopeful language. It was the kind of place where optimism worked harder than resources, where people clapped because they wanted to believe. Emily stood near the side, papers pressed against her chest, listening more than speaking. Years had shaped Emily quietly, strength without show, confidence earned, not displayed. Emily had learned how to exist without taking up too much space, a habit formed early and never fully unlearned. When James entered, the room shifted, not loudly, not obviously, just enough for attention to tilt in his direction. People noticed without knowing why. James wore success in the subtle ways, the calm posture, the absence of urgency, the sense that James could leave at any moment and the room would feel it. James saw Emily immediately, not as Emily was now, but as Emily had been, standing by a fence, holding food with steady hands. The years collapsed in an instant, the noise fell away, the promise, frozen in time, pulled sharp and present. Emily glanced up once. Emily's eyes passed James without stopping. James felt the impact of that more than he expected. They were introduced as strangers. Names were exchanged. Titles followed. Polite smiles filled the space where recognition should have been. James listened to Emily speak, not about herself, but about others, about needs, about gaps, about people the system still failed to see. Emily's voice was steady, familiar in a way James couldn't explain. James wanted to say it then, to step past formality and return something that never belonged to James alone, but the moment fractured. Someone interrupted. Another speaker took the floor. The room shifted again. Time stretched. James stayed close without being obvious, watched the way Emily folded her notes when she thought no one was looking, the way she paused before answering certain questions, choosing words carefully, the way she thanked people who overlooked her role entirely.
Recognition came in pieces, not from Emily's face, from Emily's behavior. Emily gave credit away too easily. Emily listened longer than required. Emily noticed who wasn't being heard. The same girl, just older, sharper, carrying weight Emily never complained about. Emily, on the other hand, noticed only that James seemed oddly attentive, that James's questions lingered on details no one else cared about, that James remembered things Emily mentioned once and never repeated. It unsettled Emily. They spoke again near the end, this time without a crowd pressing in, close enough for real conversation, still public enough to prevent honesty. "You're very invested in this," Emily said, nodding toward the program. James smiled. "I've learned what small things can do." The words landed.